A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin, I have to say really enjoyed that episode about neoliberalism, which you described as the operating system of our modern form of government. And I have to say, love the fact that you leaned on a tech analogy. So much of our episodes are about technology, and I guess it must be a bit vexing for those who are outside of the tech bubble to hear these sometimes. But at least for me and other techies, sometimes it does provide a good way to understand what drives our world. And I think if we were to look for words to describe the dominant system of governance that we have around the world at the moment, it would be, well, we have the collective feeling that something just isn't right. And it's very hard to pin down exactly what we mean by that. But I'm talking about the divisive rhetoric, the wars that we see taking place, the social inequalities. Something feels deeply rotten, not just about any one country or system of governance, but about the international community as a whole. We have the United Nations that sort of was supposed to bring in this era of peaceful coexistence. And for anyone else based in Israel, it's hard to talk about the UN without thinking about all this kind of heavy baggage and our belief, which I certainly share in, that the US has been very unfair in its treatment of Israel. But regardless of that, it seems like this era of global cooperation and the mutual flourishing of nations has really kind of not yielded maybe the fruits we envisioned that it might have. And the type of leaders we have, or which we see many of in the world, Donald Trump is maybe the most classical example in Trumpism, but we see these very authoritarian strongman style leaders in different contexts and in different countries. We see people like Vladimir Putin, we see Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Jinping in China, Putin in Russia. Did I say Putin twice? And they have in common this very authoritarian or top-down style of leadership that seems so at odds with everything we're told to emulate in the way we go about structuring leadership in other contexts, like the companies that we have. We're told that authoritarian leadership is the classic, old-fashioned, old-schooled way of doing things that's no longer fit for purpose, and we're always, encouraged in different contexts to move towards more collective or authoritarian or shared decision making. We see this in the context of distributed networks, which you've talked about as well, or distributed forms of decision making, which are very collectivist in their nature. And yet, there's a massive contrast between what we're working on in these capacities and the type of people we see at the helm of our societies. In fact, a glaring contrast. I have a few specific questions, Herman and Corin. The first of which is it fair to say that we're living through an era of the flourishing of authoritarian leaders? Because we're always trying to understand the difference between the visibility we have into world government and world affairs through the era of real-time information that we have, which makes everything more visible more quickly, and what's actually the case. Sometimes we think, for example, that the world seems incredibly violent and much more violent than it's ever been. And when we look at the data, we see that actually isn't borne out. And some might say the world's never been more peaceful. We just hear about the conflicts a lot more. But I'd be curious to test this theory that we are in the era of authoritarianism globally. Now, there's in the 190 plus countries in the world, we're going to find some countries with a much less authoritarian system or style of leadership. But looking at the trend and the main flavors rather than each country in isolation, I'd be curious to get your take on what you think about that. And there's an essay by Keith Bybee, a professor of law at Syracuse, who describes Trumpism as, in an academic article titled "The Rise of Trump and the Death of Civility," which analyzes Trump era norm breaking through the lens of civility and its role in democratic culture. And that's actually what I find so pronounced about the way Donald Trump does business as a president of the USA. I'm not going to get into my feelings about Trump, but I will say that I would be more pro-Trump than many listeners might expect. But as a non-American, that's purely coming from his international policy and as it affects me in Israel. I know Americans have a lot of grievances with domestic issues, but one thing that I do feel, irrespective of when I find myself agreeing with the way Trump solves things and does business, is that the manner in which he does it is often just incredibly abrasive and brash. And if I were to put my finger on something, it's the lack of civility in statesmanship. That's exactly it that Keith Bybee pointed on. That really stands out. It's an era where the era of statesmen being respectable and polite and addressing nations and resolving things through, even if war was resorted to, just the very rhetoric, the type of language they used, like the stuff you see Trump posting on X and Truth Social, it almost feels like a spoof. It's very often hard to tell whether something is actually genuine or you have to do a double take. And it's kind of inconceivable to think that just a couple of decades ago, we were still in the era of nighttime addresses to the nation and very formal and statesmanlike acts of conduct that we have seen really totally disintegrate. And not just with language, but the way in which opponents are attacked. We've seen, for example, Trump use name calling against people he doesn't like, including Joe Biden, who he famously called Sleepy Joe. And I find that really distasteful. I know that might seem very prudish to some people, but you can attack someone's policies without trying to make a caricature of them. So I think that's really lamentable that kind of rhetoric has been normalized. Politics is never going to be, a kids show, but there has to be a way that we can have a vibrant political discourse without seeing so much of that stuff in it. So Herman and Corn, I'd love to get your takes upon how we got to this point in world affairs. Are we truly living through an unprecedentedly, I don't think I'm going to get that right, unprecedentedly authoritarian point in history? Does it just seem that way? And what would you say about the lack of civility, as Bybee put it, which has accompanied this epoch in our history?
You know, it is a strange time to be looking at the global map. It is February 26th, 2026, and the world feels like it is pulling in two completely opposite directions at once. On one hand, we have this incredible era of technological decentralization. We have blockchain, peer-to-peer networks, and horizontal collaboration tools that allow a kid in Jakarta to build a software empire with a team in Berlin and Buenos Aires without ever talking to a central authority. But on the other hand, the actual seats of political power seem to be getting narrower, more vertical, and more concentrated in the hands of single individuals than we have seen in decades. Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly this tension. He's looking at the dominant systems of governance and feeling like something is fundamentally off. He mentioned that despite the collective models we use in business or distributed networks, we are seeing this massive rise in authoritarian, strongman-style leadership.
Herman Poppleberry here. And Daniel is hitting on something that political scientists have been sounding the alarm about for years, something they call the third wave of autocratization. It is a heavy topic, but it is one that connects so many of the threads we have been pulling on lately. Daniel mentioned leaders like Donald Trump, who is now well into his second term here in the United States, Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, and Xi Jinping. He is asking a really pointed question. Is this a genuine flourishing of authoritarianism, a structural shift in how humans want to be led, or are we just seeing it more clearly because of the 24-hour news cycle and real-time information? Is the world actually getting darker, or is the spotlight just getting brighter and more focused on the shadows?
It is a great question because our perception of the world is so filtered through these digital lenses. We see every tweet, every rally, every decree in real time. But I think before we get into the visibility aspect, we have to look at the hard numbers. We can't just rely on our gut feeling or our social media feeds. Is it actually happening, Herman? Are we objectively moving away from democracy on a global scale? Or is this just a localized blip that feels bigger than it is?
Unfortunately, Corn, the data suggests this is much more than a blip. If you look at the reports from the V-Dem Institute at the University of Gothenburg, which is arguably the most comprehensive database on democracy in the world, the trend is pretty devastating. Their 2025 report, which just came out, confirms that we are in a period of democratic backsliding that has erased almost 35 years of global progress. Freedom House has also reported nearly 2 decades of consecutive decline in global freedom. In their recent reports, they noted that the number of countries experiencing a decline in political rights and civil liberties far outnumbers those seeing improvements. We are currently at a point where more than 70% of the world's population lives in autocracies, either closed autocracies or electoral autocracies. That is up from about 48% just 10 years ago. For the first time since the late 1980s, there are more closed autocracies than liberal democracies. So, to Daniel's point, it is not just a feeling or a result of social media. The democratic backsliding is a measurable statistical reality. We are seeing the dismantling of checks and balances, the erosion of judicial independence, and the systematic targeting of the free press in countries that we used to consider stable democracies.
That is sobering. And it is interesting how Daniel framed it as being at odds with how we are told to operate in almost every other context of modern life. In the tech world, or even in modern corporate management, the mantra is all about flat hierarchies, agile teams, and collective decision-making. We talk about the wisdom of the crowd. We experiment with decentralized autonomous organizations where the code is the law, and we praise the leader as servant model. We are told that the most efficient way to solve a complex problem is to distribute the cognitive load across a network. But then, you look at the nation-state level, and it feels like we are retreating back to the 19th century model of the great man theory of history. We are looking for the one person who can stand on a stage and say, "I alone can fix it." Why is there such a massive disconnect between how we run a software company and how we run a country?
It is a massive contradiction, and it points to a deep psychological tension in the human species. I think part of the reason for that retreat is a direct reaction to the overwhelming complexity of the systems we talked about in episode 858. When we discussed neoliberalism as the market's operating system, we talked about how it can feel cold, impersonal, and incredibly complex. Neoliberalism promised that if we just let the markets work and the institutions manage the technocratic details, everyone would eventually benefit. But for a lot of people, that hasn't happened. When people feel like they are being buffeted by global forces they cannot control, whether that is AI-driven automation, mass migration, or the sudden shifts in global supply chains, there is a very human psychological urge to look for a protector. A strong man promises to cut through the red tape, the complex institutional frameworks, and the expert consensus that people feel has failed them. The strong man offers a return to agency. He says, "The system is a maze, but I am a bulldozer."
Right. The promise of simplicity in an overcomplicated world. It's the appeal of the clear, decisive voice in a room full of people arguing over footnotes. But then there is the second part of Daniel's prompt, which is the lack of civility. He mentioned Keith Bybee's essay, The Rise of Trump and the Death of Civility. Bybee, who is a professor at Syracuse, argues that the traditional norms of respectability and politeness in statesmanship are not just gone, but have been replaced by something much more abrasive and intentionally provocative. Daniel pointed out that he appreciates certain policies, especially regarding the international situation in Jerusalem, but the rhetoric, the name-calling, the nicknames like Sleepy Joe, or the constant belittling of opponents, it feels like a total breakdown of the system itself. It's like we've moved from the halls of Parliament to a professional wrestling ring.
Bybee's work is fascinating because he suggests that civility was never just about being nice or having good manners. Civility was a functional part of the democratic machinery. It was a set of protocols that allowed for the managed disagreement necessary for a pluralistic society to function. It provided a way for people who fundamentally disagree on the most basic values to still work together within the same institutions without resorting to violence. When you lose that, when you move into an era of what researchers call affective polarization, where you don't just disagree with your opponent's tax policy, but you view them as an existential threat, a moral failure, or an enemy of the people, the institutions stop working. You can't compromise with a monster. And if your opponent is a monster, then any tactic used to stop them is justified. That is the death spiral of democracy.
And that breakdown of civility seems to be a feature, not a bug, For these authoritarian-style leaders, it is a way of signaling to their base that they are genuine outsiders. They are not part of the polite, polished elite that the voters feel has ignored them for decades. By being abrasive, by breaking the rules of how a statesman is supposed to talk, they are proving their authenticity to their followers. It is a weird inversion where being rude is seen as being honest, and being diplomatic is seen as being a liar or a snake. The more the media and the establishment gasp at a leader's lack of decorum, the more that leader's base feels like he is finally fighting for them.
It is the performance of strength through the rejection of norms. If you can break a long-standing norm, whether it is a norm about how you talk to the press or a norm about how you treat the Department of Justice, and you get away with it, you are demonstrating power. You are showing that you are bigger than the system. That is very appealing to people who feel like the current norms have only served a specific class of people while leaving them behind. But the cost is the disintegration of the public square. When we lose the ability to have a shared language of respect, we lose the ability to compromise. And democracy is, at its core, a system of managed compromise. Without it, you only have the exercise of raw power.
It makes me think about the world Daniel's son Ezra is going to grow up in. If this trend continues, the concept of a statesman might be totally unrecognizable by the time he is an adult. We might be looking at a world where international relations are just a series of transactional, high-stakes personality clashes between various big men, rather than institutional cooperation. We're already seeing this with the way international treaties are being treated, not as binding obligations, but as temporary deals that can be torn up the moment they aren't convenient for the leader's domestic narrative.
That is the big fear. The international community, the United Nations, the various trade and climate treaties we have relied on since the end of the Second World War. They are all built on the assumption of a certain level of institutional civility and shared truth. They require a belief that the person across the table represents a stable state, not just their own personal whims. If that is replaced by a global arena of strongmen, then the risk of miscalculation and conflict goes up exponentially. We actually touched on some of these statistics in episode 645 when we looked at the return of large-scale war. When power is concentrated in one person, there are fewer people in the room who can say, "Wait, this is a bad idea." The yes man effect is the greatest threat to global stability.
So let's dig into the visibility question Daniel asked. Is it possible that we have always had these types of leaders, but we just didn't see them as clearly? I mean, throughout the 20th century, there were plenty of dictators and strongmen, but maybe they were more localized. You had your Cold War despots, but they were often hidden behind a curtain of state-controlled media. Now, because of the internet, a populist movement in Hungary or a crackdown in Turkey can be seen, studied, and even emulated by people in the United States or Brazil in real time. Is the strongman just a viral meme that has gone global?
I think visibility definitely plays a role in the contagion of these ideas. We are seeing a globalization of the authoritarian playbook. Leaders are learning from each other in a way that was impossible 50 years ago. They see what works in terms of media manipulation, how to flood the zone with conflicting information to exhaust the public sense of truth, how to handle a rebellious judiciary, and how to use social media to bypass traditional gatekeepers like editors and journalists. Real-time information means that an oratory style or a specific type of nationalist propaganda that works in one country can be adapted and deployed elsewhere almost instantly. It's like a political A/B test happening on a global scale.
It is like an open-source movement for autocracy. That is a dark thought. But it also means that the resistance to these trends is also more visible. We see protests in one capital city inspiring movements across borders. But the strongman model seems to have a natural advantage in the digital age because it thrives on conflict, and conflict is what the algorithms are designed to amplify. The digital landscape isn't a neutral field. It's tilted toward the loudest, most divisive voice.
That is a crucial point. The attention economy is almost perfectly calibrated for the authoritarian style. Nuanced, civil, institutional discourse is boring. It doesn't get clicks. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't trigger the dopamine hit of owning the other side. But a leader who makes a shocking statement, who insults a rival, or who breaks a long-standing tradition, that dominates the feed. It forces everyone to react to them. In a way, our digital infrastructure has become a breeding ground for this style of leadership. We have built a coliseum, and then we act surprised when gladiators show up to play.
It is a feedback loop. The more polarized the public becomes, the more they demand a leader who will fight for them. And the more the leader fights, the more polarized the public becomes. It feels like a cycle that is very hard to break once it starts, because the very tools we would use to break it, like calm, reasoned debate, are the tools that the system has already rendered obsolete.
Herman, are you there?
Mum? Oh, Mum, I am actually in the middle of recording the show right now. We are on the air, so to speak.
I know. I just wanted to remind you that I left that container of vegetable soup by your front door this morning. Don't let it sit out too long, Bubbler. It has the good marrow in it. And did you call the dentist about that crown? You can't keep putting that off, Herman. Your jaw will start to click.
Mum, I will call you back in 20 minutes. I promise. We are talking about global authoritarianism and the decline of the democratic world order.
Oh, that sounds very important. Just don't forget the soup. It is your favorite. Hi, Corn. I hope you're keeping Herman focused.
Hi, Dorothy. Thanks for the soup update. I'll make sure he eats it.
Sorry about that. Where were we? Right, the cycle of polarization and the rise of the strongman. It's hard to talk about the end of the world when your mother is worried about your dental work.
Actually, maybe that's the perfect transition. We were talking about how the digital infrastructure feeds into this. But I want to go back to Daniel's point about business and distributed networks. Why hasn't the success of those models translated into politics? If we know that diverse collaborative teams make better decisions in a tech company, if we know that agile is better than waterfall, why do we keep voting for the waterfall version of a human being to lead our governments? Why do we want a CEO king instead of a Scrum Master president?
I think it comes down to the difference between a goal-oriented organization and a nation-state. In a business, everyone is generally aligned on a single goal, which is the success of the company, usually measured in profit or growth. Because the goal is clear, distributed decision-making is an efficiency tool. But in a nation, you have millions of people with fundamentally different values, conflicting priorities, and totally different visions for the future. Distributed decision-making is incredibly hard when there is no consensus on what the goal even is. A strong man offers a false sense of consensus by saying, I am the goal, I am the way, I am the voice of the people. It is a shortcut through the messiness of pluralism. It's much easier to follow a person than it is to navigate a complex, multi-stakeholder process where you might not get everything you want.
And that shortcut is very tempting when people feel like the pluralistic system hasn't delivered for them. If the experts and the technocrats, the people we talked about in episode 592, haven't been able to fix the economy, stop the wars, or address the housing crisis, then people start looking for a wrecking ball. They don't want a better committee, they want someone who will just smash the system, because the system feels like it is failing them. They see the civility of the old guard as a mask for their incompetence or their corruption.
And Keith Bybee's point about civility fits right in here. Civility is often seen by the frustrated public as a tool of the establishment to prevent real change. They see politeness as a way of tone policing, the marginalized or papering over deep-seated structural problems. So when a leader comes along and is intentionally uncivil, it feels like they are finally telling the truth. It feels like they are stripping away the polite lies of the ruling class. It is a very powerful rhetorical move. It's the he says what we're all thinking defense.
But it is a move that has massive downstream consequences. When you kill civility, you also kill the possibility of a peaceful transfer of power or a shared reality. If your opponent is not just wrong but a monster who must be destroyed, then you can't afford to lose an election. Losing an election becomes a death sentence for your way of life. That is where the authoritarianism really starts to set in. It becomes a matter of survival rather than a matter of policy. And once you're in survival mode, you'll support any strongman who promises to keep the other side away from the levers of power.
That is the core of the democratic backsliding we are seeing. It is not just that people are voting for strongmen, it is that the strongmen are then dismantling the guardrails that were designed to limit their power. They are changing the rules of the game so they can't lose. They are gerrymandering, they are packing courts, they are changing election laws, and they use the lack of civility to justify it. They say, the other side is so dangerous, so radical, so uncivilized, that we have to take these extreme measures to save the country. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of institutional destruction.
It is interesting that Daniel mentioned he is based in Israel, because that is a place where these tensions are incredibly visible. You have a society that is a global leader in tech and innovation, the startup nation, which is built on collaboration and flat hierarchies. But at the same time, the country has been grappling with some of the most intense political and social divisions in its history. We saw the massive protests over judicial reform in 2023, and then the existential crisis of the wars starting in late 2023. The role of the leader in that context becomes even more central, and the rhetoric becomes even more charged.
And you see the same patterns there as you do in the United States, Hungary, or India. The use of rhetoric to divide the public into us versus them. The attacks on the judiciary as being an unelected elite. The move toward a more personalistic form of power where the leader's survival is equated with the nation's survival. It is a global phenomenon, and it is happening in countries with very different histories and cultures, which suggests there is something about our current global moment, perhaps our digital and economic infrastructure, that is making this model of leadership more viable.
So, what do we do with this? If the trend is real, if it's backed by data, and if it is being fueled by the very way we communicate, is there a way back to a more civil, collective form of governance? Or are we just in a new era where the strongman is the dominant style, and we have to figure out how to survive it?
I think we have to look at how we can rebuild the institutions that foster civility without them feeling like tools of an out-of-touch elite. We need to find ways to make distributed and collective decision-making work at scale, which is something we explored in episode 583. It might mean moving away from the massive, centralized nation-state model towards something more local or more network-based. We need to find ways to give people a sense of agency and protection that doesn't require a strongman at the top. We need to close the complexity gap so people don't feel so overwhelmed that they reach for the simplest, loudest solution.
But that feels like a very long-term project, Herman. Rebuilding institutions takes generations, and the strongmen are here right now. They are making decisions about climate change, about nuclear weapons, about the global economy today. We can't wait 50 years for a new model of liquid democracy to emerge while the current system is being dismantled.
No, we can't. In the short term, I think it comes down to the public demanding a return to certain norms. We have to stop rewarding the most abrasive voices with our attention. We have to recognize that civility is not just about being polite. It is a public good, like clean air or clean water. If we continue to treat politics as a blood sport, we shouldn't be surprised when we end up with gladiators instead of statesmen. We have to consciously choose to support leaders who value institutions over their own personality.
It is a tough sell, though. It is like telling people to eat their vegetables when there is a giant bowl of candy right in front of them. The outrage and the conflict are addictive. They provide a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose. It feels good to be part of a tribe that is fighting a monster.
They do. But the hangover from that addiction is what we are seeing in the news every day. It is the wars, the social inequality, the failure of international cooperation that Daniel mentioned. At some point, the cost of the candy becomes too high. I think we are reaching that point. People are starting to realize that the strongman promise is often an empty one. They might be strong, but they are often only strong for themselves and their immediate circle. They don't actually fix the complex problems. They just find new people to blame for them.
That is a key insight. The strongman model is inherently exclusionary. It relies on having an enemy to fight. If you aren't part of the chosen group, then the strength of the leader is a threat to you, not a benefit. And eventually, the circle of the chosen group tends to get smaller and smaller as the leader becomes more paranoid and more protective of their power. It's a model that eventually eats itself.
Precisely. That is the historical pattern of authoritarianism. It starts by targeting a specific minority or an outside group, but eventually it turns inward. It is an unstable system because it relies on constant escalation and constant conflict to maintain its legitimacy. Democracy, for all its messiness, its slow pace, and its frustrating compromises, is a much more stable way to manage a complex society in the long run, because it allows for peaceful correction.
So maybe the visibility Daniel asked about is actually a good thing in the end. Maybe by seeing these patterns play out in real time across the globe, by seeing the strongman playbook, being used in different languages and different contexts, we can start to recognize it for what it is. We can see the glitch in the matrix, we can see the playbook, and we can start to develop a counter playbook.
I hope so. And I think that counter playbook has to involve a new kind of civility. Not the old, stuffy, elitist politeness that was used to exclude people, but a functional digital age civility that allows for deep disagreement without dehumanization. We need to learn how to fight for our values without destroying the arena we are fighting in. We need to protect the rules of the game, even when we really want to win.
That is a great way to put it. We have to protect the arena. Because once the arena is gone, there is no place left for politics, only for force. And that is a world that nobody wants to live in, regardless of their political leanings. Force doesn't care about your ideology. It only cares about who has the biggest stick.
And that brings us back to Keith Bybee's essay. He points out that civility is a public good. It is something we all benefit from, even if we don't realize it. When it is gone, everyone loses. So the task for our generation is to figure out how to reinvest in that public good in a way that feels authentic, inclusive, and capable of handling the complexities of the 21st century.
It feels like we are at a tipping point. The next decade or two will probably determine whether this authoritarian wave is a temporary regression, a last gasp of the 19th century model, or a fundamental shift in how humanity governs itself in the digital age.
It is a high-stakes moment for sure, but I am encouraged by the fact that people like Daniel are asking these questions. The first step toward fixing a system is recognizing that it is broken and understanding why. Daniel's observation about the contrast between our collaborative tech models and our top-down political models is a really important piece of that puzzle. It shows that we already know there is a better way to organize ourselves. We just haven't figured out how to scale it to the level of the nation-state yet.
It really is. We have the tools for a more collective future. We just haven't figured out how to apply them to the biggest problems we face as a species. But the potential is there. If we can run a global open source project with thousands of contributors, why can't we run a city or a country with that same level of transparency and collaboration?
It's the challenge of our time, and maybe that is the takeaway for our listeners. Don't just look at the strongmen on the screen. Look at the ways you are collaborating and building things in your own lives, in your businesses, in your communities. Those are the seeds of a different kind of power. That is the horizontal world trying to be born.
I like that. The strongman is a relic of the past, even if he is using the tools of the future to stay in power. The real future is likely to be much more distributed, much more collaborative, and much more complex than any one person can control.
I agree. And as we navigate this transition, we should probably keep an eye on the data. Let's look for those small signs of democratic resilience. They are out there in local elections, in new forms of digital organizing, in the persistence of independent journalists. They are out there even if they don't get as many headlines as the latest abrasive tweet.
Well, this has been a deep one. Daniel, thank you for sending this in. It is a topic that is clearly on a lot of people's minds, and for good reason. It is the big story of our time.
It really is. And if you want to dive deeper into the historical context of how we divide ourselves, I highly recommend checking out episode 750, where we talked about the architecture of the other. It fits perfectly with what we discussed today regarding the rise of the us versus them mentality and how it is physically and digitally constructed.
That is a great suggestion. And hey, if you are enjoying these deep dives, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or Spotify. It genuinely helps the show reach new people who are looking for this kind of discussion. We're trying to build our own little decentralized community here, and every review helps.
It really does. We love seeing the show grow and hearing from more of you. It makes the research worth it.
You can find all our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today, at myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there and a contact form if you want to send us a prompt like Daniel did. You can also email us at show@myweirdprompts.com. We read every single one.
And we should mention that our music is generated with Suno. It is always interesting to see how these AI tools can contribute to the creative process, even as we discuss the challenges they pose to our political systems.
Definitely. Well, Herman, I think I need to go see if I can find some of that soup your mum left. It sounded delicious, and I'm starving after all this talk of global collapse.
You stay away from my soup, Corn. That is my Shabbat lunch. I can see you eyeing the door from here.
We will see about that. I'm faster than I look. Thanks for listening, everyone. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep questioning the systems.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird